Hey, it's Alex. Welcome to Papertrail. I don't know if you can tell, I've got a bit of a cold, so sorry about that. My guest today is Lara Williams. She's the author of Treats. It's her debut collection and it is fantastic. I heartily recommend you check it out. Lara picked 3 books that make for really interesting company to her own work, actually, and as usual, there are links to all of them in the show notes, so you can check that out after. This was a fun interview. Lara was great, and I'd like to thank her for her patience as we were setting up. I had some technical issues as usual. That's enough from me for now. Here's Lara Williams speaking about 3 of her favourite books.
I read in my lunch hour without fail. I take a full lunch hour every day. I go sit. Luckily, I work at the university, so we've got an on-site library. So I go and sit in the library and desperately antisocial with my colleagues and read alone and get really upset if anybody disturbs me. And so that's good. That gives me a sort of guaranteed hours reading every day. And I do a lot of reading at home, so a lot of reading in my flat, sometimes before bed, sometimes when I get in from work. But yes, I do a lot of reading.
So yeah, that lunchtime that's precious hours. I was never very good at snatching that extra, just an hour's reading. There's always someone who wants to have a chat. But yeah, probably being on university, I guess, is good. People do they respect that silence in the library, don't they?
They do in the library. A lot of my colleagues, if they say to me, do you want to go for lunch? I just say, no, I'm antisocial. Sorry.
Just disappear.
Deal with it.
Yeah. Well, you got to get that reading in. You got to get your books in. So I'd like to start, if you don't mind, with you reading an extract from something that you've written. So this will be from your collection, Treats. So yeah, take it away.
I'm going to read the beginning of one of my stories called Here's to You. A house seems bigger with nothing in it, though nobody mentions the filth. The dry matter curled in the corners, the sludge below the sink. Without the television and cabinets, the requisite trinkets and knickknacks, there was little to distract. They had been living like pigs. Anna scanned the skirting boards, feeling sick, a retch poised in her throat like a synchronized swimmer, present since the day she was handed her notice. The kitchenware packed up and shipped off, the DVDs and paper packs binned. Anna used to gather and disseminate these things across the local charity shops, only to reaccumulate the same old crap over again, her materialism plumping and shedding like the lining of her womb, this an essential hysterectomy, easy on the hysterics. She slipped her hand down the side of the couch, the doughy lumpen mass, once the heaving pivot of their love, the anchor of their alliance, now pushed to the peripheries to gather dust. Grazing the tips of her fingers, she found a bracelet, a tiny gift from her boyfriend Joyce. She clipped it around her wrist. He had been all right. He had, skittish and flapping, a certain buffoon lumber. She remembered when he gave her the bracelet, how he presented her with it before tea one night, impossibly happy to be sat on the sofa giving her this. She locked up and posted the keys, heading to the car to move back home. Had things come to this? They had.
Fantastic. Thank you. You're very good at capturing real moments and real everyday life, which is something that I noticed reading the 3 books that you've chosen, and I'd like to get into that more as we go. But let's start with the first book, which is Self-Help by Lorrie Moore. Could you introduce it a little bit for our listeners and tell us a little bit about what it is and why you chose it?
Lorrie Moore is an American author. Self-Help was published in 1985, and it was her first book. The short story collection, I believe, was written for her sort of MSA thesis and was later published as a book. I think it's got about 8 stories in the collection. A few of them are second-person stories, and they are mostly sort of domestic narratives. They're all in very kind of recognizable, often domestic settings, and they deal with themes of relationships, motherhood. They're written in a very sort of 1980s kind of emergent post-feminist world, and they're just very beautifully written. And yeah, the first time I read it, I felt like, wow, you can write stories about this. Like, you can write a story about going to work and meeting somebody, and it was quite a sort of epiphanic moment.
No, I think it's a wonderful collection. And you say it's got this sort of 1980s tone to it, but I think it still feels quite modern. It feels it felt very current to me as I was reading it. I thought there were a lot of themes that you could still relate to what's going on right now.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think maybe the fact that it was written in 1985 makes it feel slightly more radical than maybe I necessarily appreciated when I first read it, because a lot of the themes she deals with were quite emergent themes, and she was quite sort of fresh in engaging with them.
And when did you first read it? When did you first come across the book?
I came across the book about maybe 10 years ago, and it's actually quite a charming story. I went to Waterstones and I was going to buy the Miranda July collection, No One Belongs Here More Than You, and I'd sold out of that, but the bookseller that I was talking to said, oh, if you like Miranda July, you'll really like Lorrie more. So I bought Self-Help on his recommendation, and by strange coincidence, I now play in a band with the bookseller. I thank him by providing very rudimentary drum beats in his band. I've always liked very sort of wordy, verbose fiction. I sort of less nowadays, but I used to really adore Douglas Coupland for his prose. I still admire him now on a sort of sentence level, but I'm sort of less impressed, I suppose, by his works than I was when I first read them. And I think that's what stood out. I feel like her prose style is something that I hadn't come across. It's just so sort of beautifully precise. I love the way she sketches details that maybe seems innocuous and become quite meaningful. I really felt reading her prose is actually exhilarating. Just the way she writes sentences, it's so sort of so emotive and wonderful. Even if she's just writing about her kitchen, it becomes like one of the most beautiful paragraphs. And I think that's what immediately drew me to her.
It's a very, very lyrical book, but it goes along at quite a pace. Like you can sort of you don't necessarily need to, but you can really gallop through it if you want to. It's she's got a really lovely rhythm to the way that she writes.
Yeah, it's really sort of Moorish, because every sentence is just such a joy to read that you really want to sort of whiz through it. And I think it really merits sort of a few reads. A writer she did remind me of, and sort of another sort of similar experience is Nabokov. I think she writes in a very sort of similar dense style to Nabokov, that there's so much detail in every sentence, but it's just composed so carefully that it doesn't feel dense. It feels sort of light and airy.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's I read someone was reviewing it after I'd read it, and I think someone described it as the first read. It sort of feels very much like go ahead, sort of laugh while you can, and then sort of when you come back to it a second time, it starts off because it's quite funny in places, and then sort of either the rug gets whipped out from under you, or it continues to be funny, but you're suddenly aware that there is something else underneath it. Like it's a really, like you say, it's light and airy, but it's very layered as well. Like it definitely rewards repeat reading. Like, do you reread it often, or do you come back to it?
I do reread it quite a lot. I do read. Lorrie Moore is definitely my favourite writer, and I do return to her stories, whether in this collection or in others. Although I do think there's something particularly special about this collection. So yeah, I do return to it quite often. And yes, I agree. There is this sort of mirth and humour that is consistent throughout it, but there's this sort of real vein of melancholy that is kind of weaved into the, like, sort of between the jokes, and I feel like the jokes make it that more heartbreaking.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it makes a lot of sense to me that you say that she is your favorite writer, because I was sort of I'd read Treats, and then when you get recommended Self-Help, when I was reading that, I was like, this makes sense. This you can sort of feel that in there, in a good way. It's definitely it's not the same, but it's certainly influenced by and using similar approaches to not always the same problems, but similar problems or similar situations. Was it is Lorrie Moore one of the reasons that you lean towards short story? She's
definitely one of the reasons that I wanted to start writing. the copy I have now, I was trying to dig out the other books to kind of refer back to them ahead of this interview, and I could only find Self-Help, which implies that I've lent the gin closet, and Bad Behaviour, and haven't had them returned. But Self-Help I've never lent to anybody, because this is probably the third time I bought Self-Help after giving it out to people and not getting it back. And this copy is particularly precious to me because it is signed by the woman herself, who I went to go see at a reading when I was on holiday in New York. And I knew she was going to do a reading. I had a real feeling that she was going to do a reading, and I was really poised, ready to book tickets and go. And I was first in line to have my book signed. And I handed her the book, and I really earnestly said, "You're my favourite writer of all time, and you're the reason I want to be a writer, and just love you so much." And she just signed it and didn't make eye contact with me, and just seemed incredibly uncomfortable with my candid, embarrassing love.
It's hard. It's hard to sign. I know people who've done book signings. It can be exhausting, but still, at least you got to listen to her read. What was that like? It's I've read a couple of these aloud, and they do sound great when they're read aloud. What does it sound like with Lorrie Moore reading something?
Weirdly, it wasn't actually Lorrie Moore reading them. It was Parker Posey, the actress.
Oh, okay.
So she read them. I feel like Lorrie Moore books, there's a sort of dryness to them. I feel like you don't really necessarily need to imbue it with much kind of vocal character, because the prosody of the sentences is so good that it doesn't really need that kind of musicality put into the reading. And she read them quite sort of musically. I would have maybe preferred a kind of drier reading, but it was such a wonderful event.
Have you read any of her non-fiction? I'm quite a keen sort of creative non-fiction reader. So when I saw, is it the Empathy Exams? Is her other non-fiction, her collection of essays?
That's actually Leslie Jamison, the Empathy Exam.
Oh, there we go, getting tangled.
But strangely, Lorrie Moore does write a lot about TV. She does write a lot of non-fiction, and she writes TV reviews, and I love that so much. She writes these kind of really over-intellectualized sort of deconstructions of like Homeland. So they're definitely worth investigating. Yeah. I'm so into the fact that she applies her sort of wonderful writerly skills to TV criticism.
Fantastic. Well, okay, so I've mentioned her already, so maybe we'll jump straight to Leslie Jamison and the Gin Closet, which was your second choice. Could you just sort of talk a little bit about the book and what it means to you?
I came across the Gin Closet a couple of years ago. I'm actually not sure of the publication date. I think maybe it was early noughts. But I'd read the Empathy Exams first. I haven't really read much creative non-fiction, although I'm trying to sort of slowly educate myself in that world at the moment. But I absolutely adored the Empathy Exams. It was like nothing I'd ever read. So when I found out she'd written a novel, I was really excited to see how that would go. And I came across the Gin Closet, and yeah, I just adored it. I thought it was wonderful.
Yeah, it was. It can be a hard read. It was. I really enjoyed it. Like once I got into it, again, she has got that lyrical style that was maybe the reason why I mixed her and Lorrie Moore up. But I think again they both write in this sort of you can read it aloud and it sounds lovely, and it's all very poetic as you're moving through it. But again, there's stuff beneath that, the quality of language and the lyricism of it.
I think that's definitely the style of writing that I'm most drawn to, and that I try to write and try to read and try to write more. But I think again, the Gin Closet, it's really lyrical and really beautifully written and really sort of evocative. But it's got that kind of deep well of sadness that exists throughout it, which I'm also quite drawn to.
Yeah, no, it's a deep well of sadness. It's I was as I started reading it, I was like, I think this is going to be a heartbreaker. I think this book is gonna do things to me, and it did. I mean, it's a lovely book, but the poor people in it, they do suffer. There's a trend in all of your books, I think, about sort of sisterhood and friendship between women. Definitely seems, as well as that lyrical style of writing. Like within these three books, they're all quite focused on sort of the female experience and female relationships and how they interact with one another. I thought this one was interesting because it was generational as well. You had a grandmother, her daughter, and then her daughter's daughter.
It's such a complex relationship because I think there's quite a lot of vanity in the relationship, because you've got the character of Tilly who sort of sees herself as this quite heroic character, sort of leaning in to save. Is it Susie?
Her mother's sister is Susie, I think.
And so they kind of form a bond in spite of the kind of perhaps less pure motivations of her initially going in to sort of save her. I read I don't know if you read A Little Life. I read that like a few months ago, and it kind of reminded me of the gin closet. It's a lot more kind of traumatizing, the subject matter, but I quite liked writing about traumatic experiences without this sort of kind of phony lens of redemption, because I think there's this sort of compulsion to write about traumatic experiences and this kind of upworthy triumph over adversity thing. And I really liked that the gin closet could have gone that way, but it didn't. It was just like, no, terrible things happen, and sometimes there's really no triumph to be found, which is obviously why it's such a fun book.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you say about that lens of the lens of either this is going to get better, or it can get better, sort of a positive lens, or just putting a positive spin on a sad situation. It's definitely it's an unflinching book. Like it's like these people are having a bad time and you're going to live in it. Like, and they put you right there. And as a reader, I really appreciated that, I think, because it exposes to you stuff that if you have a less broad reading experience, or if you haven't encountered this kind of literature before, then it really points you at a new viewpoint, and it's can be unpleasant, but it's very rewarding as well.
Yeah, maybe it's a little sadistic now that I think about it, that sort of type of writing. I'm really gonna take you through the ringer here, and there's gonna be no happy ending.
Yeah,
and then I'm leaving you to get on with your life.
Yeah, what's that? There's that cartoon that goes around the internet. That feeling when you finish a book and everyone walks past, not realizing that you've had some sort of emotional breakdown.
It's true. When I was reading A Little Life, I had my sister staying with me, and I was finishing it in my bedroom, and she came in, and I was just in floods of tears. She was like, "Oh God, what's happened? You've just finished my book." It's so sad.
Yeah. No one can understand that until it's happened to them, I suppose. But when it does, it's a special thing. It's a special thing when that happens. When a book can move you to any extreme of emotion, I think.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the parallels between Gin Closet and the next book we're going to talk about, like Two Girls, Fat and Thin, by Mary Gaitskill, is it's sort of about, again, you talk about that way, like it could get better. It's about two people coming together and trying to help each other, but then that decision being made to move apart, or not being made to move apart, but just being forced apart by events. Again, at the end, it's quite interesting to see the parallel between the Gin Closet and Two Girls, Fat and Thin. I don't know if that occurred to you as you're reading. It's always a case, as I'm reading these books, obviously I'm reading them with you and your writing and these three books in mind as I'm going through them. But I don't know if that's something that, as well, like that idea of people coming together and either very different people or people from very different backgrounds and experiences getting mashed up and seeing what happens, that sort of situation. Does that kind of thing interest you?
Definitely, yeah. I think there's an appeal to kind of develop characters and then smash them together and see what happens. But I think something that the Two Girls, Fat and Thin and the Gin Closet have in common is that this idea of kind of a connection transcending background or experience, and that they both find something in each other, and perhaps it's a bit selfish at times, but it's ultimately rewarding and kind of transformative for them both.
Yeah, I think in a way as well they can be representative of you sort of say that idea that there's no happy ending, but it's also an argument for, you can have a worthwhile relationship with someone that doesn't last all that long or that doesn't last forever. So it's sort of a tribute to that as well. Definitely,
and that's something that I really look for in fiction, and I think that's actually something that I really loved about self-help, is the idea of transience and accepting transience and not wanting things to last forever, and that's okay. And just because something doesn't last forever and it isn't permanent doesn't sort of undermine or devalue what it is. I think that's probably one of the reasons I like short fiction so much, is this idea of kind of transient connection or experience that sort of stays with you.
Yeah, it's like you get someone opens a door for 5 minutes and you get to look inside, and then they shut it, and everything's carrying on, but it's like that's enough. That gives you what you're looking for.
And also thematically, I think a lot of particularly Lorrie Moore's short stories, because you've only got the kind of finite word count to deal with those things. It's kind of, I suppose it's easier to write about kind of transient connections with people. So a lot of the things she writes about are kind of people you meet for a short space of time, but they change you in some way. And there doesn't need to be that kind of permanence in the connection.
That's true. There's a technical link as well as a spiritual link. It makes sense to write transient things if you haven't got much room. I've never thought of it that way. That's very interesting. Great. Okay. Well, let's move on then. We've mentioned it already to Two Girls, Fat and Thin by Mary Gaitskill. Again, this is when did you encounter this, and what's it about?
I actually encountered this in the university library where I work.
On a lunch break.
It was a lunch break, a lunch break trawl of the shelves, and it's on one of the courses at the university. And I was just interested. I'd heard the name Mary Gaitskill, and I was wondering why they had something like 25 copies of this book that, to my understanding, was kind of a little cult novel. So I checked one out, and I just found it just such a wonderful, peculiar book. I almost couldn't believe a full novel was written around this very strange niche subject, and there's so many interesting parts to it. That kind of one of the characters is sort of approximation of I'm going to really struggle remembering her name. Ayn Rand, yeah. Ayn Rand. So yeah. that in itself is such a peculiar feature of the novel, and she kind of writes fat objectivism in a way that you don't find completely hateful, that she kind of gets something out of that's self-empowering, even though I'm certainly not defending Ayn. She's a terrible human being.
Yeah.
But for her character, I found that quite interesting, and I was so interested in this kind of theme of these women kind of throwing themselves into these terrible experiences and terrible relationships just to sort of feel alive and to feel exhilarated.
Yeah, both women that sort of the book focuses on, they've both been through different kinds of pretty extreme trauma. But what's quite interesting, I think, about the way that the book is actually formed is you don't know that the first time you encounter them. You get that almost like it's not a short story scenario, but you get two strange people put in a room with each other having to have a conversation, and it's interesting, and then they sort of go away, and then for the next, I'd say for the next half of the novel, you spend time with them individually as they grow up and see the sort of the horrifying things that happen to them, and then they get flung back together, and suddenly they're having sort of similar conversations, but you have all of this backstory and all of this extra understanding, which I loved, like as a way of putting the novel together and of sort of challenging your perspectives on characters and why people are like how they are. I thought it was really excellent.
Yeah, there's a sort of depressing kind of predeterminism to the narrative that like these are two people and terrible things are going to happen to them, but maybe they're not. No, they definitely are. And they meet again, and yeah, they're still sort of the same people, really. Yeah, I have chosen 3 books of which there isn't a whole amount of redemption.
No, you pick 3 sad books.
Yeah, whenever anyone asks me what sort of books I like, I just say books about sad girls. If you've got a book about a sad girl, probably I will enjoy it and read it.
Well, it's interesting because I was reading a description of that it was a conversation with someone about Leslie Jamison. They talked about her as the Mary Gaitskill of her generation. So
oh, really?
Yes, yeah. They did this. They said, you know, she does very similar things, and they're approaching very similar topics. So it's interesting that you sort of came across. Was it Two Girls, Fat and Thin? You came across before the Gin Closet?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So it's quite interesting that you sort of just come across them as you go. But I guess it also makes sense that you would come across one after coming across the other.
Yeah, that's interesting. No, I hadn't heard that before. I just had a thought that came to mind and it's just disappeared.
That's fine. It's again, I think, in the same way as in the Gin Closet, it's a very hard book. It does not flinch away from not just unpleasant moments, but unpleasant moments with what is supposed to be at least a partially sympathetic character, sort of at its heart, doing some of the unpleasant stuff. And again, I think that only adds to the end when they do come back together and you understand them better. But it's interesting, parallel. You know, the two characters themselves. You know, one fat, one thin, different experiences, different outlooks on life. They parallel each other throughout the entire book, and then at the end, in the reverse of sort of the Gin Closet, they are not flung together in glory, but they are brought together rather than separating. And I thought that was a very interesting conclusion to the book. One that I wonder about. I wonder if I like this ending or not. But I'm curious what you thought of the way that the whole thing was wrapped up.
In Two Girls, Fat and Thin, it was quite an extreme ending. I quite like how she puts these kind of extreme modes of being into these sort of kind of domestic settings and these quite sort of like normal characters that you wouldn't expect to have these experiences. Whereas in the Gin Closet, I found the ending a little bit flippant. I found it, and I don't know if the ending was intentional, but I found the ending a little bit sort of reductive of the rest of the book. It felt too kind of neat a full stop. I prefer how Two Girls, Fat and Thin, it's sort of more abstract towards the end.
Yeah, it's that ambiguity that I guess again it's that more of that short story style ending, I guess, where it's sort of you're pulled back from a scene as it's still happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's the Gin Closet it is sort of a definitive full stop, but it's almost a full stop in a way that I guess you could say is expected, which is not something that I would say for most of the Gin Closet. Like a lot of stuff that happens in that book I was not expecting to happen, but that final ending I was sort of like, oh, I think this is going to happen. I
felt like that was maybe what you're expecting, but I still found that kind of reveal a little reductive in terms of I would have maybe preferred a book that kind of explored those things throughout the book rather than kind of sort of revealing this sort of Pandora's box at the end. And it felt a little bit kind of, oh, that's why this person had a traumatic experience and that's the reason for the book. And I found maybe that was a little sort of a bit too glib.
Yeah, no, I can see that, but it's still overall it's still one of your go-to recommendations.
Oh, definitely. I absolutely loved it, and I think I'm only saying that in retrospect because at the time I was completely broken by it. But so perhaps I'm just trying to kind of drum up something other than like gushing admiration.
So in terms of looking at all three books as well, I think one of the things that stood out to me about all three is just the way that they talk about sex and sexual politics. They're very it's that unflinching look, but very sort of matter of fact, and the way they'll delve into something, and it's not sort of sex isn't throwaway. Like there'll be a considered conversation about it, or something will happen, and they'll really dwell on what this means and why it's happened. And I thought that was very interesting as a sort of a consistent trend between the choices. Yeah,
I'm definitely really interested in relationship fiction and sexual politics in fiction. And I think that can be quite kind of, not scorned, but it's sort of seen as quite a kind of light subject. And I quite like the fact that the three writers don't deal with it lightly. They deal with it kind of with possibly an over-considered way. I quite admire that for all of them. I also like that while they do kind of sort of intellectualize sex and sexual politics, there's also a lot of kind of letting things happen to them and then deconstructing those experiences afterwards.
Yeah, I would say in particular with the gin closet, quite often it feels like a bad thing happens and then they'll think about it. Like it's you'll get like this bad thing has happened and you get put in that moment and the unpleasant thing happens and then you'll get a lot, and that just sort of adds to the whole experience. If the book goes on, they sort of pile on, but it's never. I don't think it ever felt over the top, but everything just sort of always it winds very nicely in with everything. It winds very nicely in to create quite an unpleasant experience, but it's all very nicely. It's very artfully. It's always artfully handled, I think, is what I'm getting at. All three of these, they artfully handle hard topics, and yeah, that's something that I would say that I appreciated most. As looking at all three of them as a whole, I would say that they really delicately and artfully approach topics which are sometimes taboo or just make people uncomfortable to talk about. So yeah, I don't know whether you agree with that.
No, I absolutely agree with that. When I was kind of sort of reminding myself of the three books ahead of this podcast, I came across this Mary Gaitskill quote that I really love, because she writes about masochism in relationships a lot, and the quote was that she kind of wants to write about this feeling of women kind of allowing themselves to be treated badly, and like, this is what your love means to me, like your love means shit to me, and the idea of these things being almost quite an aggressive act. So this idea of passivity as being actually quite an aggressive passivity.
She's a very interesting person. I was reading more sort of about, when I finish a book, I sometimes like to go away, and I guess it makes sense doing this podcast. I like to go away and find out more about the author and see who they are. And she seems like a really interesting person with some really. I mean, is that something? Do you know when you read a book and you really appreciate them? Do you go away and research the author a bit, or do you like the author to stay distant and just take the work as it is?
No, I like to obsessively go away and read every interview and find out absolutely everything about the author. Actually, Mary Gaitskill is somebody else who writes some really great non-fiction.
I guess it makes sense. I guess with this kind of writing feels journalistic in nature. Or it's that, not a disembodied voice, but it's an accurate, precise, and honest voice. I think all three of these have very honest voices.
Yeah.
So what are you reading at the moment? Anything of note that you're loving? I mean, you've already mentioned A Little Life.
By strange coincidence, I'm reading Mary Gaitskill's new book, The Mayor. I was actually thinking, I haven't read anything new from her in a while, and I hadn't really read any of her, and I was just sort of reminding myself of why I love her so much. It's a very different sort of mode of writing than a lot of her stuff. It's quite a domestic setting. It's more kind of, it doesn't deal with the sort of extreme topics that maybe she's more famed for. It's about kind of family and children. It's really wonderful. I'm enjoying that very much. I'm trying to think other books that I've really enjoyed recently. I really enjoyed Lara and Goff, Fates and Furies. I enjoyed that a lot. One of my New Year's resolutions this year was to read more non-fiction. So I've been reading an awful lot of non-fiction. I just finished a book about women in silent film, a collection of essays. That was very interesting.
Oh, I could geek out over non-fiction for ages. If you haven't read any John Jeremiah Sullivan, I love him. I think he's an essayist. He wrote a autobiography, or a sort of autobiography. I don't know, it's weird. It's a memoir. It's about his relationship with his father, but it's also about the history of horse racing and horse bloodlines. And I do not like horses at all. Like I don't like. I was riveted. I love that book so much. It's fantastic. That's my little side plug. Do you tend to do you read a lot when you're writing, or do you tend to fill up on books and then do you swear off them while you're writing?
I try to keep both of them as a sort of consistent. I try to dip into writing as consistently as I try to read, although I definitely don't. I would like to. So I don't particularly kind of read in a strategic way or not read in a strategic way. I suppose I keep them sort of separately, kind of trotting along.
Yeah, a healthy balance is the best way forward.
Although there's nothing worse than when you're reading a sort of masterful writer and I'm in the middle of writing something that is just a nightmare to write and I hate, and you return back to this like wonderful book and then you're looking at your own writing thinking, good God, how am I producing such rubbish?
Yeah, no, I remember there's some phrase someone used once, yours is a draft, theirs is a finished product, or something like that. Never compare a work in progress with a finished product. It's an easy one to think. It's a hard one to apply, I think.
Yeah.
Well, Lara, thank you very much for coming on the show. Thank you very much for your recommendations, and congratulations on Treats. It's definitely one of my favourite collections of the year. I think it's fantastic, and I heartily encourage everyone listening to go and check it out if they haven't already.
Thank you very much.
If people want to find you online, where can they do that?
They can find me on Twitter, or they can find me on my I've just sort of attempted creating a website. So larawilliamswriter.com is where they could find me if they so wished to.
Great. Well, are you writing at the moment? Are you working on another collection or a novel? I'm
sort of midway through a novel.
Brilliant.
And whether it's any good remains to be seen.
Oh well, yeah. I hope that goes well, and I hope you don't read anything too mind blowing while you're on the draft to discourage you.
Me too.
But yes, thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and all the best in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Papertrail. Thanks to Lara for coming on the show. If you enjoyed this episode, there are lots more now in our backlog. Please go back, check them out. If you've already done that, if you could take a moment to rate and review the show on iTunes, or just tell some of your friends about it, that'd be great. You'd be really helping other people to find the show. Also, there are a lot of you out there now. Tweet me your thoughts at PapertrailPod. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks to Scott Grattan for the music. And once again, thank you, Lara Williams, for coming on the show. Pick up Treats, everybody. Give it a read. It's great. I'll be back next month with another interview. Until then, thanks for your time.